Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Killing Zone, My Life in the Vietnam War, by Frederick Downes. Narrated by Barry Press. Preface. In the fall of 1968, as I stopped at a traffic light on my walk to class across the campus of the University of Denver, a man stepped up to me and said, "Hi." Without waiting for my reply to his greeting, he pointed to the hook sticking out of my left sleeve. "Get that in Vietnam?" I said, "Yeah, up near Tom Key and I Corps." "Serves you right." As the man walked away, I stood rooted, too confused with hurt, shame, and anger to react. 10 years have passed. The hurt, shame, and anger still flood over me with the memory. But of one thing I am certain. None of the men I knew who served in Vietnam deserved to die or to be maimed, either physically or mentally. I think it is necessary now to give another view of Vietnam, that of the day-to-day life of an infantryman on the ground. I have always been asked what I thought about Vietnam, but never what it was like to fight in Vietnam. This is the way it was for us, the platoon of Delta 16. Section 1. The Bridges. 8 September 1967. At 23:30 hours, the Continental Big Bird with the golden tail DC-8 dropped through the night sky into the landing pattern over the black landscape of Vietnam. 23 hours earlier, the 165 of us had been crammed aboard the commercial jet at the airport near San Francisco. I looked around the cabin at the officers and enlisted men who had come from all over the United States to catch this flight from San Francisco. How would they return? How would I return? I had graduated 6 months earlier from the U.S. Army's OCS program at Fort Benning, Georgia, and now I was soon to be leading men into combat. I was 23 years old, and I had been trained to lead. Physically, I thought I was ready. Mentally, I was as confident of myself as any young officer could be. But underneath my confidence were the ever-present questions, worry, and curiosity about war and my role in it. I was eagerly looking forward to finding answers. I would not have long to wait. I was surprised at the number of lights below. I had always thought that a war zone would be blacked out, yet the jewels of lights spread haphazardly through the dark. I expected tracers to rip the night as the enemy tried to shoot us down, but the landing at Tan Son Nhut was uneventful. We exited the aircraft in a long khaki line to stand apprehensively under a series of large open-sided tents with tables lined up under them. The oppressive heat and humidity was filled with the smells of dust, machinery, and rotting vegetation. Everything was lit up. I wondered when the mortars would start dropping in. How could the enemy miss a target as tempting as that plane and all of these men? The plane was being refueled for takeoff. Opposite our naive line stood another line of soldiers waiting to go home. The soldiers hooted disparaging remarks at us. "It's a lick, motherfucker." "You'll be sorry." "New cannon fodder." "You guys short yet?" "Only 365 days to go?" "Shit!" We had no comeback to those veterans. After all, hadn't they just completed a tour of war duty? We suffered our ignominy in silence. We were checked through rapidly. As we were directed to the buses that would take us to the disbursement center, I looked back. Spotlights shone on the airplane that had brought us here. Pretty stewardesses in pert uniforms smiled and chatted with the boarding soldiers. The crew was inspecting the underside of the plane in a pre-flight check. I turned around to stare into the blackness in front of me. what was there? We walked to the convoy of buses sitting in the darkness with their motors running. The windows were fogged from the air conditioning which the drivers had turned up full blast. As we got close, one driver opened his door, releasing a blast of cool air and the sounds of the country and western music his radio was getting on the armed forces station. Man, I wasn't expecting this cushy treatment. This wasn't anything like a war zone. After a short ride through some checkpoints, this was more like it. We were unloaded and told to hit the sack. Barrack-like tents with wood sides halfway up and canvas for the rest of the wall and roof were our first homes. After our 23-hour flight, we plopped down to sleep on the cots lined up along both walls. There was a crowd around the bulletin board the next morning. Men were laughing or bitching as they discovered their new units. I pushed through the crowd to look for my name and found it with 4th Division next to it. 4th Division, hey, anybody ever heard of the 4th Division? Where is it operating? I never heard of it. A grizzled career sergeant was standing next to me. That's a good outfit, Lieutenant. They're stationed out at Pleiku up in the Central Highlands. I never read about them anywhere in the papers back home. Are they doing much fighting up there? I don't want an outfit that's not in action. The sergeant turned to look at me. They're spread out in I Corps and 2 Corps in the Central Highlands, like I said. Not everybody doing the fighting is in the newspapers. You'll never ever see a reporter up there. It's too rough for them. He looked at my youth. You'll get a belly full of fighting up there, son, if that's what you want. Thanks, Sergeant, I mumbled as I pushed to the back of the crowd to return to my tent. I didn't care whether I seemed anxious or not. I was waiting beside the road with my duffel bag and flight bag long before transportation arrived to take us to the airport. A C-130 leapfrogged north from one airfield to another on its journey to Pleiku. The procedure was the same each time we took off and landed. We sat in rows on the bare floor of the airplane. Long canvas straps hooked from one side of the plane to the other supposedly acted as a buffer against bumps and jolts. Actually, the straps were worthless for protection, but the colorfully dressed crew chief always made certain they were fastened each time new passengers walked up the tail for loading. I was interested in the crew chief's uniform. He was wearing a tiger-striped jungle fatigue outfit. He had a pistol on one hip and a knife on the other. He even had a knife strapped to his leg. Maybe he never did any fighting, but he sure looked the part. Sitting on the floor of the military aircraft was just one stretch of a pain in the ass. I exited the C-130 at Pleiku, glad to have it over with. We loaded aboard Deuce and a Halfs to ride across town to the camp, a huge, sprawling base on the highland plains from which the war in that zone was run. Vietnamese were everywhere, on the roads and in the camp. They were in places I thought would be taboo on a military base. As the driver navigated between the neat military tents, he explained that Americans used the gooks for all the dirty jobs. The lucky ones were the hooch maids, who had the plush job of making the beds and cleaning up the tents. "You mean every soldier has a maid, regardless of his rank?" I asked. "Yep, sir. They work real cheap, 30 to 35 piastres, or P a day, about 28 cents. It's easy living for us. At evening they have to be outside the gates, but the next morning they're lined up ready to come in again. Of course they have to have a card to get in. Security, you know." I didn't know. From everything I'd been taught about the enemy, that would be a perfect way to get information. A camp this size must employ hundreds of Vietnamese. It would be impossible to check them all. I decided not to question that line of reasoning further and asked him something I was curious about. "I noticed you called them gooks. I thought that would be what we called the enemy. Does everybody call them gooks?" "We do around here, sir." He was enjoying his status as teacher. Different units got different names for them, but it don't make no difference what you call them, you know. Friendly or not, they're all called the same. Look at them. They don't even know what good living is. They're ignorant as owl shit, you know. He blasted his horn at a group of Vietnamese to get them out of the way. Wait till you get to Sin City. Of course, you're an officer and they aren't allowed in, but you can take your rank off. It won't make no difference, you know. What's Sin City? That's a little town outside the camp near Pleiku. The Army tries to control prostitution and VD by keeping an area over there where you can go and fuck your eyeballs out if you're an enlisted man or, being an officer, can sneak in. It's guarded by MPs and everything. The American doctors check the whores 3 times a week for VD, but you got to be standing first in line after they get through to be sure you don't get the clap, you know? I was beginning to think I didn't know anything. You mean the Army supports something like that? Sure. They know they can't stick your ass over here for a year and not expect you to fuck something. So they must have decided that since they couldn't stop it, the least they could do was control it, you know? They even make sure the whores don't overcharge you. Here you are, sir, just report in that building over there, he pointed. Thanks. I pulled my bags out of the back of the truck and carried them over to the doorway he had indicated. There might not be much fighting around here, I thought, but there seems to be plenty of action. I reported to the sergeant, who told me to report to the supply sergeant for my equipment. The supply sergeant gave me 2 sets of jungle fatigues, olive drab underwear, towel, M16 rifle with magazines. He told me to stuff all my other junk into my duffel bag, gave me a card to fill out to attach to it, and told me he would store it there while I was in country. Gave me a rucksack to carry all of my things in from that point on. What unit will I be attached to? I don't know. I don't know. You got to attend a 3-day training class before you get assigned to the field. I've been in training for a year, and now I have to go to more classes? Yeah, that's SOP in this division. It used to be 5 days, but they cut it back to 3 because they need you guys out in the field. I was upset. More training. I had been training long enough. I wanted to get out with a company in the field, not jack around in some stupid base camp. But orders were orders. But first, I had to go through an endless line of company clerks asking their questions and banging the answers out on forms and their typewriters. The clerks double-checked to make sure we had turned in all American money for military payment certificates, MPCs. For the next 3 days, I was with a group of other men new in country, as we endured the now familiar routine of firing our weapons, throwing grenades, attending classes on tactics, and playing hearts at every break. I learned the camp was well protected. Watchtowers were placed at regular intervals around the entire perimeter. Bunkers were spread in between for fire support and defense. 3 concentric rings separated by barbed wire surrounded the camp. Each ring held landmines and a nasty little item called foo gas. Foo gas was 50-gallon drums filled with explosives and napalm and buried at strategic places in the perimeter. They were triggered by a blasting cap hooked up to a hand detonator. When they were set off, there was hell to pay as the flaming liquid was thrown a radius of 50 meters in all directions. It was guaranteed to break up a ground attack. On the 4th day, I was loaded into a C-30 for a bumpy ride to a place further north called Dufaux, home of the 3rd Brigade of the 4th Division. They were operating in the field on search-and-destroy missions. Dufaux straddled Highway 1 about a kilometer from the South China Sea, separated from it by a solitary mountain 150 meters high. Once only a peaceful hill surrounded by rice paddies, the mountain had been developed into a base camp a couple of months before. An airstrip was laid out on the flat ground at the base of the mountain on its western side. A perimeter had been built around the entire mountain to enclose it within the protective confines of the American camp. The mountain was only a little over a half of a kilometer long at its base, making it a perfect defensive location amid all the flat ground around it. We called it Montezuma Mountain. The camp was fully developed to the west. As more units were assigned to the camp, they were assigned areas in a steadily encroaching circle around to the east side toward the sea. The 1st Battalion of the 14th Infantry was around on the east side. That was to be my unit. I caught a ride in a jeep from the airstrip around the mountain to my new home. The battalion street was laid out at an angle from the mountain's base. The battalion commander's headquarters was located closest to the mountain, with the companies spread out in a neat line leading toward the rice paddies. The company headquarters of Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta were lined up on one side of the street. A latrine for the enlisted men was located at the end closest to the perimeter. The latrine, a 4-holer, closed off the company area. Behind each company headquarters was the supply room for that company. Off to the side, farther behind the company headquarters, were the large half-wood, half-tent barracks to house the men when they returned from operations for stand-down. The company headquarters buildings were the same type of construction, but they were divided by mosquito netting into an orderly room and individual cubicles for the officers. Between the supply room and the back of the company headquarters was a garbage can shower for the officers. Behind the battalion commander's headquarters was a 2-holer for the officers. Spread throughout the area were piss tubes for everybody. They were constructed by digging a small hole in the ground near a discreet place like a bush, sticking a packing tube used for rockets, about 3 feet long and 4 inches in diameter, into the hole so that 2 feet of it stuck out of the earth at an angle, and pouring rocks in the hole around the tube to hold it in place and to act as a drain. As a finishing touch, a wire screen would be fastened across the end. These tubes were very convenient, and lest anyone had trouble figuring out what they were, there was always a sign next to them with "piss tube" written on it. Across the area to the side of the battalion headquarters was a large mess hall shaped like a T and constructed out of the half-wood, half-tent buildings. These buildings were used for every purpose. They were built up off the ground, had wood floors, and were mostly dry. An old airplane wing tank across the company street served as the enlisted men's shower. A landing pad with room for 1 helicopter was marked out in front of the mess hall. The company area was L-shaped. Out beyond the top of the L were the bunkers and barbed wire. Beyond that, rice paddies ran to the low sand dunes along the ocean. That evening, I wandered into headquarters company looking for company and information. The company clerks were only too happy to tell the lieutenant new in country all about the best damn outfit in Nam. It was SOP to salute in the company area, but not in the field. When an enlisted man saluted, he would say, "Golden Dragon, sir." The officer would return the salute with, "Right of the line." I asked about this. They told me that the 1st of the 14th was an old infantry regiment steeped in tradition. During the Boxer Rebellion in China, the unit had fought bravely. Afterward, they had adopted the symbol of a golden dragon. The other part of the salute came from some battle in the Civil War. Right before a large battle, a staff officer asked a general where to put the 1st of the 14th. The general had roared back, "Put them to the right of the line, where they belong." The right of the line is where a leader traditionally puts his best men and units. This comes down through military history because when a man fought with shield and sword, the right arm or sword arm was unprotected. The best fighter was put to the right to protect the sword arm of the man on his left. Only the most trusted and best fighters held the position to the right. A radio call broke up our discussion. I listened to the companies calling in their action report for that day. 2 men had been killed, a number of others wounded. After the radio call, under the harsh light bulbs, I watched the clerks struggle with the ever-changing figures of the most important document in the military, the Morning Report, DA Form 1. With this report, the Army kept tabs on every man under its command, everyone from the AWOLs to those killed in action. I was familiar with the report, but now a new dimension was added. Killed in action or wounded in action were things I had only heard of. Tomorrow, I would be a candidate for both categories. I dismissed the thought of ever dying. A slight wound for my career, maybe, but nothing worse. I walked back up the company street toward battalion headquarters. The night was full of strange sounds made more awesome by the fact that I was in an actual war zone. The distant rumble of a tank engine, vehicles moving, voices of men drifting in from different directions, and uncountable insect noises formed the acoustic backdrop of war. Across the barbed wire, just meters away, was territory that belonged to the enemy. I had been warned many times already that we only controlled what was within our barbed wire perimeters, no matter where we were in Vietnam. All of this, the area where I stood, the night sounds, the barbed wire, the alien land, had yet to make a believer of me. Less than a week ago I had been drinking beer in San Francisco. The year and a half of infantry training had been against make-believe enemies who had died make-believe deaths. The XO pointed out the cots the other lieutenant and I were to use. I decided to sleep fully clothed, but to remove my boots for comfort. That was the last time in Vietnam I removed my boots to sleep. If anything happened at night in the field, we didn't have time to fumble with bootlaces. Too pent up to sleep, I lay on the cot staring through the screened upper half of the hooch at the dark sky. Suddenly an artillery gun fired from somewhere close above me. It must have been from the top of the mountain. A flare lit the sky as a 4-deuce mortar fired an illumination round. I sat up in the cot, then walked to the doorway to look at the eerie, flickering landscape around me and out beyond the barbed wire. I knew I shouldn't, but I glanced at the flare. Smoke left a corkscrew in the air behind the slowly spiraling burning phosphorus. I could hear the hissing of the burning. The light reflected slightly against the miniature parachute supporting the flare, and against the bottom of the stretched-out spring of smoke which marked its descent. I followed the corkscrew of smoke upward, but it disappeared in the darkness far above the flare. I pulled my eyes away, squeezed them shut for a second, and opened them to stare out again over the area. Deep shadows moved in elongated orbits over the ground in concert with the spiraling swinging of the flare. The shadows grew longer as the flare dropped lower. The open area not covered by the deep, dark shadows seemed harshly bright by comparison. The flickering light was strange because it did not allow for colors but made everything a contrast of light and dark, of shadow and substance. The scene presented itself to the eyes like a movie film not quite running up to the proper speed. A flickering of seeing and not seeing, with each new flare showing a little different picture than the one before. As my brain acclimated to the images my eyes were recording, the flare floated to the ground to lay there hidden by the short rice shoots in a mixture of burning light and rising smoke. For the briefest of seconds, everything was pitch black until my night vision started to come back. I lay down again, still unable to sleep because of the sounds of mortars, 105 recoilless rifle, and artillery guns occasionally firing around. There was no pattern to any of it. Maybe we were being attacked. Very soon I learned that this nighttime display was known as H&I fire, harassment and interdictory fire. This was a procedure followed by the Americans intended to confuse and demoralize the enemy. The idea was based on the fact that there were no friendlies outside the perimeters at night in this part of Vietnam except American patrols and ambushes and allies. all of whom were carefully marked on the commander's maps. Anyone else moving in zones 1 and 2 at night was considered to be the enemy. With a little luck, one of those shells would surprise the enemy by dropping unexpectedly on the trail or clearing at the same time he was there. H&I fire seemed a good idea to me. A little wasteful, perhaps, but a hell of a good thing for our morale. I finally allowed my mind to become adjusted to the different sounds and intermittent light, and fell asleep. 13 September 1967. This morning the XO hustled me into a helicopter that was flying out to the battalion located in the field. I jumped aboard with my rifle, web gear, and rucksack, and sat on one of the canvas seats in the middle of the helicopter. It was a style called a Huey, or a slick. It was called a slick because it didn't have any weapons fastened on the outside of the fuselage. It only had 2 door gunners, one on each side, armed with M60 machine guns mounted on a swivel. The slick was used for transport of supplies and men. It had a pilot, co-pilot, crew chief, and 2 door gunners. This allowed the slick to carry 6 fully equipped infantrymen into an LZ. The 2 side doors were always fastened open or removed. It was rumored that any enemy soldier who shot any aircraft down was promoted on the spot. If so, the helicopters helped quite a few enemy soldiers along in their careers. To supplement the firepower of ground troops and protect the slicks, the gunship was developed. This was a slick converted to a weapons carrier by adding multiple rocket launchers and machine guns. They all carried plenty of firepower and were excellent in ground support, but they were still only converted slicks. The Cobra, another fire support helicopter, had recently arrived in Vietnam. It had a narrow 3-foot-wide fuselage, was a faster fighting machine, and carried a weapons system classified as light, medium, or heavy. All 3 weapons systems consisted of various amounts of multiple rocket launchers and machine guns. Some Cobras had multiple feed M79 grenade launchers mounted in the nose. There were only 2 crewmen, one seated above and behind the other in the narrow cockpit. The Cobra was half again as fast as the Huey and a formidable weapon. The pilot landed on one of a group of small hills that marked the boundary line between the flat rice paddies that spread to the sea and the mountains that were the beginning of the ranges that covered the interior leading to the Central Highlands. The battalion had set up a fire base on one low hill from which the battalion commander directed the operation. The major introduced me to the colonel, who walked out of his CP. The colonel welcomed me and told me that I would be assigned to Delta Company as an observer, so that I would have a chance to become familiar with how the company worked in the field. He would send me out in a chopper later that afternoon. I wandered around the fire base observing the men in their different activities. I particularly noticed the 4-deuce mortars set up in the middle to provide fire support. Each tube was surrounded by sandbags. The ammo supply was next to each tube. Men lounged around their guns, smoking cigarettes and joking with each other. Most of them were stripped to the waist in the hot sun. Mud was everywhere. I stood on a rock to get a better view of the rice paddies to the east. Below me, the edge of the lush green paddies gave way to irregular flat areas of bright green, spreading as far as I could see. Clumps of trees stood out like little islands in a sea of green. Every once in a while a HE, high-explosive shell, would be fired from the tubes behind me to explode among the trees. Off to the north, thin columns of white smoke marked the leading edge of the company's movement through the rugged foothills. Each column of smoke represented a hooch on fire. I could see small groups of black pajama-clad people moving out of the hills. They were loaded down with belongings carried on their backs or across their shoulders, balanced on the long bamboo poles so
Sample complete. Ready to continue?